Welcome to this online lesson asking the question, who was to blame for the murder of Thomas Becket? Our aim today is to support a judgment based upon evidence. Okay, so this is a real historical crime that we're going to be looking at today, and it only makes sense to start by looking at the crime scene itself. So let's make a start. Here's the crime scene. I want you to imagine that you've just walked into a famous old church, and on the floor is a horrific scene. Your clues are that the date is December the 29th, 1170. That the body has been found in the north transept or chapel of Canterbury Cathedral. That there is blood, human brains and other things on the floor. A blood-stained Bible. Some chainmail armour like that pictured. 4 blood-stained swords. And a letter of complaint from King Henry II to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, sure, I've sort of made up this crime scene, and not all of these things would have been found on the floor in the real thing. But I'm trying to give you a sense of a few of the clues that you could pick up. So first of all, record these clues in your notes. And then when you're ready to continue, press play again and we'll see the next task. Okay, got the clues down? Let's see. So once we've recorded the clues, identify which might be the most important clues in helping you solve this case. Secondly, come up with between 3 and 5 questions that you could ask to learn more about the clues and find out the identity of the victim and of the murderers. Of course, the title of this lesson has already given you a pretty big clue as to one of those things. And then lastly, make an educated guess as to who the victim was and who was to blame for the murder. At this stage, you're not expected to get this right, so it's just about trying to piece together whatever information you've been able to gather so far. It'll take you between 5 and 10 minutes to complete those tasks in full sentences, so press pause and then when you're ready to continue, press play again and we'll have a look at the next section. Okay, hopefully we've got a few ideas now. Well, it's time to interview some witnesses to the crime to see what else we can learn. Remember, you will need to refer to some of your other notes based upon the clues that you have found. While we can't do these interviews live, I'll try and give you a sense as to what questions you could ask these different characters and what answers they might have given, using my usual patented time machine. As ever, the time machine is slightly faulty, and the people will come through sounding vaguely like me doing a very bad accent. But I assure you, these are real people from 1170. Honest. Before we meet the witnesses, let's have a look at Canterbury Cathedral itself. This is the actual location of the murder, and sure, quite a few things have been added on since 1170, but the layout is basically the same. The victim was chased down these stairs, indicated by the yellow arrow. The victim was then found, dead, in this location here. There is a small altar there today, but actually there was a slightly more grand altar there beforehand. The chapel behind with the posh ceiling, well, that was added sometime later. So now we've seen the crime scene, let's interview our first witness. Make a note of our first witness. This is a monk who lives and works at Canterbury Cathedral. He witnessed the murder happen, so he might be a little bit timid. After all, a man of God is not expected to see acts of horrendous violence. As a man of God, hopefully we can trust the information he's going to give you, so he's not going to lie or try and deceive you in any way. You will need to make notes on who the victim was, how the victim was killed, and who might be to blame. I, as your teacher, will take the part of the lawyer, and then we'll hear what the monk says in response to the different answers. Afterwards, we'll have a look at the key evidence that's come up, and make sure that you update your notes and make sure that you've got every piece of information that you need. Call to the stand, witness number 1, the monk. Good morning, Father. I'm sorry about all the things that you have witnessed at this time, and I hope that your answers can help us get to the bottom of what happened in this grisly murder. Could I ask you first of all who the victim was?
Yes, the victim was the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who I knew and trusted very much, a man called Thomas Becket.
Okay, thank you. I know that this might be distressing to recall, but could you describe to us how the victim was killed? Anything that you saw and any information that you can give us will be very useful.
Well, I'll tell you what I know. I saw the victim, Archbishop Thomas. He ran into the cathedral in some sort of panic, and he was followed by 4 different men. At least I think there were 4. It all happened in something of a blur. I noticed that they weren't wearing any armour, but they had concealed swords underneath their robes, and so I tried to hide behind one of the pillars of Canterbury Cathedral, and I really didn't see that much. Okay, I understand that this might be distressing for you to talk about, but is there anything else that you can tell us at all? Well, I saw Thomas run down the stairs into the north transept of the cathedral, where he was pursued by these men. Thomas grasped onto one of the pillars of the cathedral, and they tried to drag him out the door. I don't think that they really wanted to kill a man inside the cathedral, knowing what a dreadful sin to God that would be. But for some reason these men persisted, and Thomas was struck down most dreadfully. So, who do you think might be to blame for this? I really couldn't say. I mean, obviously most directly the men who killed Thomas with their swords, well, they would be most to blame. But they shouted something as they ran out of the cathedral. I didn't quite hear it clearly, but they said something along the lines of, "Such things happen to traitors." I really am not sure. I was hiding and I was terrified. Thank you for your answers. Okay, no further questions. Let's have a look at the key evidence that we've gathered then. The victim was Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. We may have already got that information. Also, we may have already got that the victim was gruesomely murdered in a chapel of Canterbury Cathedral on December the 29th of 1170. It seems that the monk mentioned that there was more than one attacker, possibly 4. The attackers had the weapons of knights, but they seemed to be disguised, perhaps hiding their weapons underneath their robes. Alright, make some additions to your notes now, so that you've got everything that you need before we call the next witness to the stand. Pause the video while you do that. Call to the stand witness number 2, Knight-Reginald fitzUrse. So, what leads do you have already that you might help you with your questioning this time? This time you need to make notes on the role of Reginald fitzUrse in the murder. Who else may have been present at the time that he can tell you about? And who might ultimately be to blame for this gruesome murder? Now, Sir Reginald, we have a few questions for you regarding the gruesome murder of Thomas Becket. Firstly, how do you plead?
I would plead, I'm not sure. Well, I certainly killed the man, but I don't feel guilty about it.
Right. So, are you admitting to the crime?
Oui, I did kill him, but I wasn't alone, and I was certainly not operating on my own orders. I'd been told to do this.
Right. Let's break this down. You were saying you did not do this alone. Who else was there? Are there any other names that you can give us?
Oh, let me think. I was present with a few friends. You see, we had just returned from Crusade, where we had taken part in many violent acts, but we were happy to be home in England.
You say that you are home in England. You don't sound particularly English.
Oh, but you have to understand that many of the nobility at this time speak both French and English, and we mostly speak French and have great estates in Normandy as well as in England. Anyway, you're asking me about my friends. Are you sure they won't get in any trouble?
Well, that is certainly not for me to decide, and ultimately I'm sure God will decide your fate.
Well, I suppose I can tell you a few things. So, my friends and I had returned from Crusade. Had I mentioned that? Oh, I think I had. So, there was myself, Reginald fitzUrse. There was my other friend, Hugh de Morville. There was Richard de Le Breton. And finally, William de Tracy. These are the men who took part in this killing with me.
Well, thank you for that information. That may well be useful. But you seem to be very comfortable speaking about such shocking events. What happened as far as you can tell?
Well, look, it is quite simple. We are knights, we act on the orders of the king, and the king ordered us to kill Thomas. The reasons why he did this, you would have to ask him. However, we were at the king's castle, and we heard him shout out something along the lines of, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And we decided to act, and we rode to Canterbury Cathedral and decided to carry out the king's orders.
Well, even if what you say is true, that is hardly an incitement to murder Archbishop Thomas Becket. Who will rid me of this turbulent priest could have many meanings.
I know that, but I'll be honest with you, we had had a few drinks, and so perhaps we acted slightly rashly. But I can tell you that the king did shout something out, and he did seem very angry with Thomas.
Right, well, I'm almost afraid to ask, but how did you actually kill him?
Oh, well, we are not shy about these things. We are knights, we are warriors. We go into war all the time, and we are witnesses to horrible things. What I can tell you, though, is that we did not want to kill him in the cathedral, and we tried to drag him out, but he got loose and ran into the cathedral. So we thought, well, if we are doing the king's work, that is like God's work, so what is the harm in killing him there? So I took my sword and I smacked him on the back of the head with it, on the flat of the sword, and he fell to his knees. Whilst on the ground, one of my friends came in with his sword and just took the top of his head off. Imagine like how you take the top of a boiled egg off. And then he got back to his knees and was praying again at the cathedral altar, and we finally dispatched him with another dash to the head, and we scooped his brains out onto the floor and kicked him about, shouting how he shouldn't have upset the king. It was a sort of standard day, you might say. Well, it doesn't sound like the sort of standard day that I would have inside a cathedral, and may God have mercy on your soul. No further questions. All right, let's have a look at the key evidence that we've got from Reginald fitzUrse. Firstly, you should have written down his name by now. There were 4 knights: Reginald fitzUrse, Hugh de Morville, Richard le Breton, and William de Tracy. The knights had recently returned from crusade, had been drinking heavily. This might explain their rash actions. The knights claim that they were acting on the orders of King Henry II, although from what they've said, it doesn't sound like a clear order to kill. Henry is said to have called out for Becket's death in a rage, but he didn't directly order the knights to kill him. Pause the video while you make any necessary notes. Done? Okay, let's move on. Call to the stand, witness number 3, King Henry II. What was his relationship with the victim? We'll need to note down his role in the murder, what he's going to do next, and who does he blame? Your Majesty, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I'm sure that it feels very strange speaking at your own court. Well, indeed it does, and I hope you haven't brought me here to waste my time. No, Your Majesty, it's very important that we get to the bottom of these things. So, we would appreciate it, Your Majesty, if you answered a few of our questions. Very well. Firstly, we'd just like to know what your relationship with Thomas was. Did you have a good relationship with him? Would you consider yourselves friends? Well, yes, actually, I deeply regret Thomas's murder. After all, we had been good friends for a good number of years. That's precisely why I appointed him as Archbishop in the first place. After all, as Archbishop, having a friend in the position, I thought that my relationship with the Church as a whole would be improved. I see. So, would you say that you had had a bad relationship with the Church before that point? Well, I suppose it was a little bit rocky. Look, I had a few disagreements with the Church. I felt that they were treating their own priests too leniently when they had committed crimes, and that I, as king, should have more power over the way that the religion was managed in this country. Is that too much to ask? Therefore, Thomas, who was pretty much a low-born man when I knew him, was raised up to the position of the most important priest in the country, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was my understanding, and Thomas knew this, that if he was going to be Archbishop, then he would do as I said, and I would have more control over the Church. I see. So, did something go wrong with this? Well, yes, of course it went wrong. Thomas decided that his duty was to the Pope and to the Church, not to me. So my whole plan of getting more control over the Church was ruined. As you can imagine, as a king who's used to getting his own way, I was pretty angry about this. But I did not intend for poor Thomas to be murdered. That much is true. So, how did he end up dead? Oh, I don't know. Some drunken knights heard me shout something and they took matters into their own hands. I did not order them to do this. And if I ever get my hands on them, then they can expect very severe punishment. So you do accept some responsibility. I have in my notes here that it says that you shouted out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Can you confirm that you said this? I said nothing of the sort. In fact, I'll tell you exactly what I said now. What I actually said was, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" But of course, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest" is rather more catchy, so I imagine that's what everyone will remember. So you do agree that you shouted out in anger.
Yes, but tell me, is there anything from what I said that incited these men to murder Thomas? I would say no. However, I accept that I do have some responsibility here. I also realise that the Pope is incredibly angry at me. My worry now is that the country as a whole may be excommunicated, and that I might be personally excommunicated from the Church.
Okay, so this word excommunication, could you explain to us what that would actually involve?
Well, of course, it would be incredibly severe. You see, excommunication is where one is chucked out of the Christian Church altogether. You might consider it to be a guarantee that you will end up in hell for all eternity. Also, if the country is excommunicated as a whole, it means that there can be no marriages, no burials in consecrated ground. It would be a disaster. And so I'm keen to show the Pope that I'm very sorry for what has happened. I intend to go barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral, have my back whipped and wear an itchy hair shirt to show just how sorry I am, and I'm also hoping that we can set up a great tomb and memorial to Thomas. I need to stress to you that Thomas was my friend. Yes, I was angry with him. I'm sure we've all fallen out with our friends from time to time, but at no point did I wish him to see him murdered. Those knights acted without clear orders from me.
I see, Your Majesty. Well, thank you for your time, and I appreciate your honesty in these matters, and I can hope, well, for the souls of all people in England, that the country is not in fact excommunicated. No further questions. So let's have a look at our key evidence for King Henry II. Henry had been close friends with Becket, but they had fallen out. Henry had made Becket Archbishop, hoping that this would give him more control of the church instead of the Pope. Henry had called out in a rage, but didn't mean for Becket to die. And Henry is terrified now that the Pope will excommunicate him and possibly the whole country itself, so he's very sorry for what has happened. Pause the video while you make notes of the key evidence. Done? Well, let's move on. What you'll need to produce now is a table like this one above. You'll need space to write 3 things underneath each heading, and the heading should be King Henry II, the Knights, and Becket himself. Your task will be as follows. You will be given examples of evidence. Arrange the examples in a table like the one above. Once you've done that, you can sum up how each of the 3 groups may have been to blame for the death, which group or person may be most to blame and why, and which group or person was least to blame and why. You might be wondering why I've included Becket himself. Surely we're not blaming the victim here. Well, the truth is Becket should have been aware that he was putting himself in a dangerous position by disobeying the king, knowing full well why the king had made him archbishop. So he does bear at least some responsibility for the events that happened here, though whether he really deserved to die would be a matter of opinion. The information will be appearing on the next screen, so by all means pause the video here and make a note of your tasks, or just flip back to this stage in the video if you need to review them. Pause the video now while you do that. Let's have a look at the evidence. Remember that these facts will need to be listed underneath these headings. Number 1. Made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping to control him. Does that apply to the king, the knights, or Becket himself? Tried to take some of the church's power for himself. Again, is that the king, the knights, or Becket? They actually killed Becket and cut his head off. Is that the king, the knights, or Becket? You get the idea by now. They followed Becket into the cathedral and killed him. This is a massive sin. They thought that they were acting on the king's orders. Got angry and called out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" or words to that effect. As Archbishop, he wanted to please God and the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Christians, and not the king. He was a friend of Henry II, or at least he had been. And Becket took the job of Archbishop knowing that Henry hoped to control both him and the church. Pause the video while you note down these bits of information underneath the correct headings, and then we'll go through some answers. Remember too that there are some extension tasks, so if you need to flip back in the video and remind yourself what those are, then do so. Pause the video while you complete the task. It'll take you probably 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes if you're a slow writer. Alright, let's have a look at the answers. Who made Becket Archbishop? That was of course King Henry II, who was trying to take some of the church's power for himself. But he didn't actually kill Becket. That was the Knights. They followed Becket into the cathedral and killed him. This is a massive sin. Also the Knights. And they thought that they were acting on the king's orders. That's the Knights too. But who got angry and called out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Well, that was King Henry II. The last three then are all Becket. As Archbishop, he decided he wanted to please God and the Church rather than the king. He was a friend of King Henry II, or at least had been until he had fallen out with him. And Becket took the Archbishop's job knowing full well that Henry had hoped to control him, so he knew he was putting himself in a dangerous position. If you need to make any corrections, pause the video while you do that. If not, we'll move on. So who was to blame for the murder of Thomas Becket? Now we're going to write a piece of structured writing to answer this and to show how we've made a judgment based upon the evidence we've gathered so far. Firstly, you'll need to describe what happened to Thomas Becket. Who was he? Where was he murdered? Etc. Then you'll need to explain the role of King Henry, the Knights and Becket in the murder. Make sure that you explain the role of all of them, not just one group. Here's a writing frame to help you with that. You don't have to use it, but if you're stuck for a sentence starter, have a look. Then you'll need to explain who was to blame in your opinion. This is where you choose the group or person that you think is most to blame for what happened. There's no wrong answer here. It's about you selecting the right evidence to back up your judgment. Lastly, you'll need to compare it to another opinion. Why is your point of view more correct than others? Why, for example, if you are blaming Becket, is he more to blame than the Knights who actually killed him? Here's where you would explain that. Again, I've included writing frames should you need them. It'll take you between 15 and 20 minutes to write this out, possibly slightly longer if you're a slow writer, and if you're anything like me, you'll really want to give this some thought. So, take the time over it and pause the video while you complete this task. So what happened next? For the next 350 years, Becket's tomb became a location of pilgrimage, so people made religious journeys to his tomb. The Pope had made Becket a saint, saying that he had died for his beliefs. Thousands of visitors from all over Europe travelled to Canterbury to pray at Thomas's grave. Today, the grave is no longer there. Henry VIII got rid of it when he reformed the church. However, Canterbury Cathedral now marks the location of St Thomas's grave with a candle, as shown in the photograph. I used to live in Canterbury, and I know it very well. And when you go there, you can see a very slight worn groove in the floor where thousands upon thousands of pilgrims' knees dropped down as they prayed at the tomb of St Thomas. If you look at the shine on the floor in the photograph, you can just about make out on the left there where those knees were hitting the ground. It's an incredible reminder of what was once an incredibly holy place. So, your first question to sum up. Do you agree that Becket died for his beliefs? Explain what you think. And secondly, the king was not punished after he showed that he was really sorry. In the event, the Pope chose not to excommunicate him. Do you think that this was right? Explain your opinion again. And there are no wrong answers here, so spend between 5 or 10 minutes answering those questions, and pause the video while you do so. So whatever you think, the Pope certainly thought that Becket had died for his beliefs and therefore had become what we call a martyr. As for the king not being punished, well, there are probably lots of political reasons why he was never actually punished, but I'm sure he was deeply relieved. Certainly, he made a real show of how sorry he was for the rest of his reign. Oh, one further thing. Look at this. It's a little badge. Yes, it's rubbish, isn't it? Think about when you last went on holiday. Think about the sort of tourist souvenirs that you pick up when you go there. They're rarely very good quality, are they? Well, this is one such tourist souvenir. Pilgrims would be sold cheap badges like this as souvenirs that they could wear to show that they had been on a pilgrimage to Thomas. It was their little way of showing off that they'd been on a religious holiday of sorts, although I'm sure for many of them it was a very serious event too. So that might explain the poor quality of this item. Here's a little bit of an extension for you. You can produce a wanted poster to show who you think was most to blame for the murder of Thomas. You might not have time to do this depending on how long your teacher has given you for this lesson, but if you do have time, here's how you can lay it out. You can work in a pair, or if you are working on your own, you can do that too. Decide on who is most to blame for the murder. Is it King Henry II, the 4 Knights, or Thomas Becket himself? You should include their names, what happened to Thomas Becket, and 1 to 3 explained reasons why they are to blame. So on your wanted poster, you'll need to put that they are wanted for the murder of Thomas Becket. It happened on December the 29th, 1170. And you can add these other details too. I'll leave the rest of the layout up to you. So if you want to complete that task, you can pause the video now. Let's move on to the final bit. Finally, who do you think was most to blame? Why not vote for it? Was it King Henry II? Was it Thomas Becket? Or was it the Knights? Whenever I do this lesson live and I've got a class in front of me and I ask them to vote, I get a different answer virtually every time. But typically the most common one is Henry II himself. It's rare that people blame Becket himself because after all he was only doing his job as Archbishop. On the other hand, King Henry II was the one who had fallen out, had tried to control the church and had lost his temper. The Knights, well sure they did the act, but after all they felt they were acting on the orders of another, even if perhaps a little bit too much ale or wine is to blame for them thinking this. So how should these people be punished? I think Becket had already had his punishment. King Henry II, as we found out, was very keen to demonstrate how sorry he was for the rest of his reign, but he wasn't ultimately punished. Becket had had his punishment and was, in the beliefs of the Pope at least, destined to go to heaven as a saint. And what about the Knights? Well, the Knights escaped, and they were actually basically not punished at all, but they were exiled and they never really returned to England again, and they sort of disappeared from history at that point. Well, that's the end of the lesson. I hope that you found it interesting, and I hope that you liked the format that this took. Other than that, if you did enjoy it, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and there'll be more content soon. Thanks very much for watching.